Also, as I was undergoing my, through the doctoral program, we were required, of course, to complete an internship. And so one of the requirements, we did 10 different professional developments, particularly aligned with leadership. And I had the opportunity to attend some of the school leadership meetings that focused on English language learners. And I was really surprised to find out that English language learners, particularly in our county, as well as throughout the state of North Carolina, have one of the widest gaps. But unfortunately, there has not been as much of a focus in addressing these gaps and these educational disparities. And so that is what kind of got me interested, particularly in this area, as well with the social studies being that is my content area that I teach, all connected with my background, as well as drew me into the direction of focusing on this specific study. So some of the limitations of the study, there were two specific ones that applied. First, the fact that participants may not have known any other ESL programs outside the ones in which they received initial training. Secondly, the study depended on the complete cooperation, support, and willingness of ESL teachers and school leaders who may have to discuss academic settings or programs that they are no longer a part of. Also, some of the delimitations that were applied to the study, there were three. First, the inclusion of the study was limited solely to ESL teachers and school leaders who are currently facilitating or supervising instruction for English language learners in K-8 social studies content. Secondly, the ESL teacher and school leaders had to be actively working in the field. And lastly, I limited participation to ESL teachers and school leaders in K-8 public settings of one regional area within the state of North Carolina. The organization of this study, of course, is divided up into 5 chapters, and it is qualitative in nature. Chapter 1, of course, presents the problem statement, the purpose of the study, research questions, and discussion of the significance. Chapter 2 presented the review of relevant and aligned literature to provide content as well as context for the study. Chapter 3 focused on the research design, study participants, data collection, analysis, and procedures, and the protocol the research adopted to establish credibility. Chapter 4 relayed those results of the studies and the reports, as well as reoccurring codes and things based on the participants' responses. And in the last chapter, the findings are discussed within the context of the theoretical frameworks, implications for change, and recommendations for future research. So looking at the literature review, so some of the literature that stood out, particularly when I underwent this study, was looking at a historical overview of English language learners in the public school system. So historically, since the turn of the 19th century, monolingual schools were staffed with monolingual educators, and they've had to grapple and contend with the best way that they can to educate English language learners. And so there's been a multitude of different approaches, such as total immersion, various models that have been proposed. Hefter and Plaisance, of course, talked about these approaches and program models and how they've impacted the students' opportunity to learn. And one of the things that many scholars have established is that English language learners and those duly identified, their current educational trajectory is untenable. And the largest percentage, of course, historically, of English language learners in our nation are predominantly Latino students, Hispanics. And these students, of course, bring important funds of knowledge to the process. But unfortunately, many schools are failing to take advantage of this. Also looking at the ESL teacher and school leader efficacy, Bonk indicated from his research that many teachers and school leaders do not have a high sense of self-efficacy because of lack of preparation to work with English language learners. As for example, there are many universities as well as school systems that do not provide adequate training for teachers, mainstream teachers in this area. Also, research, conducted by Bowl, Golden, LaFlock, O'Day, Harrison, Whistle indicated too, many of these teachers are unsure of teaching strategies that would be helpful. Even some of the teachers who are quote unquote ESL teachers as well, from the study, their training was very limited as well. And there is a need, obviously, to voice the concerns and support for these students due to the changing cultural and linguistic diversity in the classrooms of our nation. Looking at English language learners in mainstream content. Bartolome, who's done a lot of research in this area, indicated that there's a need to recognize that mainstream teachers need to be equipped to effectively teach increasing numbers of culturally and linguistically diverse students, as we are seeing a steady increase. Bartolome, as well as Ariza, conducted some study focused on this, and his findings revealed that most educators, and even in the mainstream, as well as ESL and even school leaders, feel inadequately prepared when faced with instructing and assessing English language learners. And so these, again, many of these teachers, again, ill-equipped to focus on the academic content. So academic content such as social studies and teaching English language learners. Looking next at the ESL teacher challenges, the recent data from NESIS from 2019 indicates that 50% of English language learners attend schools where they are less than 1% of the student population. And multiple researchers have noted most educators and educational leaders, again, have received little professional development or training to teach English language learners. And unfortunately, there's been this gap, and oftentimes even ESL teachers are often marginalized from the other teachers mainstream, excluded from discussing systemic decisions regarding their students. As Short and Boyson identified this particularly, English language learners are the fastest growing segment of the pre-K-12 student population. And because of this, and due to the lack of training, the lack ESL teachers not being able to even have the opportunity to plan with the mainstream teachers these post challenges and reaching these students, especially with the ever-growing population. Um, and other challenges also consist of as well. Um, According to DeMathias and Izaguirre, outcomes of English language learners are affected due to this, due to the delivery of instruction. You have the time constraints, language use, and the population being served. Yoder also discussed how the ESL teacher and the public school leader, there's related challenges, particularly with the academic, social, and ability of school responsiveness when looking at the community due to language and some cultural differences. One of the studies also focused on English language learners, social studies, and culturally responsive teaching. Research has found, according to Jimenez Silva, Hind, and Hernandez, that more than half of social studies teachers have English language learners in their classes, and that however, though many of them are unprepared, but one of the strategies that has shown to be effective is culturally responsive teaching. However, unfortunately, many institutions, public school institutions in the nation, have not implemented this and there's a lot of reasons for this, because obviously STEM has incentivizes and solidifies notions of sacred contents, and thus because of that, the status of social studies has been elusive. Also, amidst an entrenched testing culture and the prevalence of associated remediation demands, trends suggest that non-tested subjects for importance scramble for instructional time and are also forced to grapple with the secondary status. And in some states, social studies is a non-tested subject area, thus it's not focused upon. And so even though these strategies like culturally responsive teaching are effective, unfortunately, it's not focused. Therefore, the strategy for instruction has not yet been considered in many areas. Focusing on exactly cultural relevant pedagogy, which has proven to be effective in Gay, as well as Latson, Billings, and Lee have focused on this research. Relevant pedagogy has three main teaching applications. It investigates students' prior knowledge, teachers' recognition and inclusions of students' prior knowledge and voice in the curriculum, and also an adjustment made during the teaching process to engage and motivate these students to participate. And so you're looking at these funds of knowledge drawn from the students' cultures. And research findings have shown that when ESL teachers and public school leaders utilize this strategy of culturally relevant pedagogy, students respond positively and actively engaging in the learning process. Now, focusing on the methodology for the study, the research design, of course, was a qualitative and a narrative inquiry approach was selected for the research design. And of course, the qualitative inquiry was based upon the real world observations emerging from the interplay from my researchers' experience, tactic theories, and diverse interests in practice, as well as developing scholarly interest. Study participants and population. So for this, there was a total of 24 participants in this study, and they represented individuals who served as ESL teachers and or public school leaders. Purposeful sampling was used to ensure diversity of perspectives could be relayed to address all the research questions. And all participants were employed in public school district located in the Sandhills region of North Carolina. Data collections, procedures and management, research interviews were the main source of data for this study. They were semi-structured, open-ended interviews, and they mostly utilized for the data collection. I traveled physically to each district and facilitated these interviews and recorded them using a digital audio recording device. All the interviews were conducted live and in person for all 24 participants, and each participant was interviewed one time, and the interview would last approximately around 30 to 45 minutes. For the interviews, they were recorded using the transcription program Rev. Every interview was transcribed in its entirety, and I carefully assigned pseudonyms to participant transcripts. Participants 1 through 24 is how they would be identified. Data interpretation and analysis. So for the data analysis, I utilized word processing software by typing and gathering first impressions and codes. Using content and thematic analysis was supplemented with the research software in vivo to analyze the data. The research that was engaged was continuous activity through examining the transcripts, paying attention to the language content, as well as the tone of the participants as they relayed their experiences and stories in the data. Validation and credibility. Firstly, the use of triangulation, and this method converged data across the different sources, which supported the emergent themes and to the corroborated experiences that were gathered. Also, the strategy that was employed to ensure that validity was initiated was member checking, accurate representation, and the transcription of the study. Participants' words, of course, were integral to the authentic data analysis, and self-disclosure of research bias was employed as an acceptable method to ensure the credibility and trustworthiness. So going into the findings, one of the themes that came out was teacher advocacy. A third of participants stated that teacher advocacy was an essential component of their self-efficacy. ESL teachers and school leaders stated that they view their role as advocating for English language learners in the public schools correlated with their success in the classroom. It also communicated that serving as advocates for English language learners is mandated by the federal government. And just looking at some of the examples from the data, one of the participants relayed, it's a challenge, of course, to teach English language learner students. So, I consider myself someone that advocates for them being a person who speaks a second language as well. So you'll see that in this in the data here. Also, participant 5, what we consider one of our pillars of ESL, the 4 main categories is advocacy, and advocacy is very important. And a lot of times English language learners can't speak English, don't have the words, so their ESL teacher is the one that has to advocate for them. Also looking at participant 18, and she shared some very personal things here. She says, I see my role obviously to struggle every day, but I think I'm a big advocate for ESL students, like just as a whole in the classroom, like setting, just trying to work with teachers and student and administration. I definitely do think equipping them, like obviously the language, English language wise, a harder task because you get very many backgrounds of students, and some have formal education, some don't. So again, you'll see from this advocacy came out as one of the major themes. Looking next, positive, conducive learning environments. Almost half of all participants stated that positive, conducive learning environments have a significant impact on the achievement of English language learners. ESL teachers and school leaders believe that positive, conducive learning environments were critical to gaining the trust and respect of students, which entices them to want to do well socially and academically. They stated that helping to foster positive, conducive learning environments enables English language learners to feel comfortable, welcome, and builds their confidence in their ability to learn. So you'll see in the data here, participant 4, I think ours is a very conducive environment to English language learners due to the fact we have so many different global activities going on. Being that we are a global school, we enhance different countries and continents around the world, and we incorporate things that could hopefully be able to lend themselves to, so that they feel more comfortable because they know they are accepted. Because when they have diversity here with the global program, that helps them to feel accepted with their diversity. And so that's an example here for participant 4. Participant 9, definitely experience like an ESL for the students. The environment is not very welcoming. It is supposed to be, but I experienced in elementary school, middle school, I taught middle school as well. And I'm here for 4 years, but for the administrator and the teacher, the reaction is not always positive. They don't think that they are. Something that we need to do about. They may excuse, okay, they don't know the language. So that, again, environment came up with this, and her sharing some of her challenge, the participants' challenges. Participant 22 also relayed this. Sometimes that leads to some conversations with teachers of how to be culturally and linguistically responsive to students and their needs when they come to a classroom, to create an environment that supports them. So this theme of positive, conducive learning environments comes in. Next, which was overwhelmingly over 21 out of 24 participants in the study, cultural and language barriers. This was indicated. ESL teachers and school leaders felt this negatively impacted their ability to meet the learning needs of these students. ESL teachers and school leaders expressed that they received a lack of training and professional development in cultural competency. ESL teachers and school leaders relayed that diversity of language was a challenge, as in many cases, there may not be anyone active in the school that is able to communicate with that student. And just some examples here from participant 1, and having a buddy, sometimes they don't understand, to me, they don't understand some of them in regards to culture, just like the routines and day-to-day things that happen, because they may be different from where they're from. Participant 12 shared, they need to learn the language first and the culture. And so my main role is having a bond with them so they can feel comfortable taking and asking questions and learning what they need to know to be successful. This participant had a lot to share here. Participant 17, that everyone doesn't understand their culture. I'm still learning about their culture. A situation, a math teacher in my school called my students Mexican. I have possibly 5 Mexican out of the 60 that I service. And I had to correct her. I was like, they're not all Mexican. Mexico is not the only Spanish-speaking country. A good portion of my students are actually born in the United States, and their families are from Guatemala, Honduras, you know. So just understand that Hispanic students are not all from one region, and they all come in with different backgrounds. And she further stated, some of them, you know, are people that, like, are they part of the caravan now? Oh my goodness. If I hear that question one more time, like, no, my kids have visas and they are not all asylum visas. Some of them did cross, you know, undocumented, but the majority are here on work visas or some sort of other, you know, arrangement due to the government. So just completely understanding that they're not all from one region. I've had students who also speak different dialects. So I had a girl who spoke, I can't remember what it's called, but she was from Honduras, and she spoke a native language of Honduras, like a tribal language. So they didn't understand why she didn't understand Spanish. They were like, well, why can't you communicate with her? Well, why isn't she learning? I was like, because she's trying to learn Spanish and English at the same time. Same thing, I had a student from Mexico, from a small town, who spoke one of their small town languages. And then at the same time, she's trying to learn Spanish and English. So even particularly from here, you see these cultural and language barriers being expressed. Next thing that came up through the study was academic language and standards. It was a total of 10 respondents who stated the focus of their professional development should focus mainly on these areas. It was expressed by ESL teachers and school leaders that mastering academic language and standards in K-8 public school setting is what is being driven due to standardized assessment. And also the study correlated English language learners' ability to acquire academic language standards to be a core component to their achievement in mainstream content such as social studies. And participant 13 indicated, in North Carolina, Canada course of study, we don't have an curriculum. We have textbooks that we have adopted that are county level, that they've adopted, that are probably 18 years old. We have, as far as curriculum goes, we got the WIDA standards, but the standard basically says they're going to speak the language of social studies. And then there are model performance indicators that are not standards, but are guides. And we have different languages. We teach language of mathematics, language of social studies, language of science. Participant 18, very, she's a community. I'm not a social studies person, but trying to understand the standards. I teach content-based ESL. So 9 weeks, if it's very social studies heavy, I try to unpack those standards to try to see what I could cover more in depth in my class and help the social studies teachers also. And participant 21 shared as far as training or professional development. A lot of that would focus on the language, and it was more language-based and language-focused, and the standards bring those in greater and integrate the two. But there's not a specific social studies content for English language learners. And this is really unfortunate for me to say because, as a K-6 person, originally we're taught to teach all subjects, so I taught social studies. But when I came out of the classroom, I started doing K-6 teacher and started seeing what was going on out there. People are not teaching social studies in elementary level. I mean, flat out. That it might incorporate some readings into their language arts instructions, even just with my own child as a parent. She would do social studies in elementary school a couple of days out of the quarter. And then moving on to the next thing that came up was culturally responsive teaching. Overwhelmingly, over 21 out of 24 participants in this study indicated that culturally responsive teaching as a best practice towards meeting the needs of English language learners in K social studies content. ESL teachers and school leaders and a culturally responsive approach would address the learner's physical, social, mental, and emotional needs. Also, ESL and teachers and school leaders express this approach would yield a great success within the classroom and stress the importance of the approach through its effectiveness in recognizing and acknowledging multiculturalism and developing lessons, units, and curriculum. So, for example, in participant 7, the data, he states, when teachers are willing to include their students' native countries on show and tells and stuff like that, when they're willing to have them share, or when even the teachers, I've had the teachers include pictures and stuff into their lessons about stuff from a student's country or culture or tradition. And looking at participant 6, I feel like there's one more thing I wanted to say, making sure their presence is known and welcome, and that they utilize material that can reach those students and that can kind of bring attention to other students in the class. Where the kids from, what the culture is like, they value that. And then participant 20 shared a lot here. I can only speak for a student population. So many of our students come from cultures that are very different than the United States. For example, Latino students come from various parts of the world. They have collective cultures. So the idea is we share, we help. Nothing that's just mine, it's all ours together. And so when you put those students into a classroom in the United States, We're very ownership oriented. Individuals versus the whole family unit. So sometimes our priorities don't match the cultural priorities. Another thing that is difficult culturally is what the word I'm looking for. For example, not just the collective culture, but how respect is shown. The United States eye contact, personal space are all real important. Many of our students, personal space is not that big of a deal. They tend to stand closer. They are loving, they're huggers. You know, that's the kind of key that you love, but at the same time, there's a cultural disconnect. So understanding those cultures helps with this, these addressing these challenges and looking at the next theme, language-based instructional strategies. 1/3 of participants expressed that language-based instructional strategies was an integral component of best practices needed to aid English language learners in K-8 social studies content. ESL teachers and school leaders relayed that linguistic challenges is the major hindrance in English language learners comprehending, analyzing, synthesizing, and evaluating social studies material. Some strategies that were shared were SIOP, scaffolding, vocabulary, graphic organizers, and Socratic seminars. And the participants relayed here some strategies such as fill in the blank, which is highlighted, scaffolding, vocabulary words, repetition, fill in the blank from participant 6. Participant 19 relayed summarizing the story, scaffolding, pictures, vocabulary, audio. Participant 18 discussed the Excel model, vocabulary, pre-teaching, reading, speaking, writing, listening. And going into the conclusion, the summary, implications, and recommendations. So just to summarize for research question 1, what are ESL teachers and school leaders' perspectives of self-efficacy among their English language learners? The major themes that emerged from the study participants was teacher advocacy and positive conducive learning environments. For research question 2, what are ESL teachers and public school leaders' unique challenges teaching English language learners? The major theme that emerged from study participants was cultural and language barriers. Research question 3, ESL teachers and public school leaders' attitudes towards their professional development and educational resources to meet the linguistic and cultural needs of English language learners in K-8 social studies content. The themes that emerged was academic language and standards. And research question 4, which focused on the best practices for creating a culturally responsive and inclusive curriculum to make those relevant connections for English language learners in K-8 social studies. Those themes that emerged from the data focused on culturally responsive teaching and language-based instructional strategies. And the implications for change should include an increased emphasis on mainstream teachers and school leaders receiving training on best practices for teaching ESL students and cultural awareness. School districts must implement and focus on culturally relevant pedagogy to address the needs of these students. Additional support could be provided to ESL teachers and school leaders in reaching English language learners in K-8 social studies content by increasing the opportunities to collaborate with mainstream teachers on lesson and unit planning. There should also be a focus and resources provided to implement these changes to provide a sense of stability and consistency for English language learners to succeed. And educational learning environments need to be facilitated that are positive and conducive for English language learners. And this can be accomplished by recognizing their culture through programs and events in the school setting. Programs should also work to support not only ESL teachers and school leaders, but also the diverse communities English language learners are coming from. And most importantly, time must be set aside to build relationships with families of English language learners in order to convey expectations for social studies and civic engagement. Recommendations for future research. This study, of course, was limited to ESL teachers and school leaders in the state of North Carolina. So this study could be conducted in other regions of the state or throughout the entire nation. As a researcher, I believe conducting a longitudinal study will aid school districts with data for strategic planning to address this needed area. Also, some recommended research study can be replicated or expanded to mixed methods, just to provide a meta-analytic approach using pre-existing data on English language learners' academic preparation and success in social studies content. Also, further research should include some pre and post test data to measure the mastery of social studies in K-8 settings for these students. And these are the references. And at this time, I'll take any questions.
Okay, great job, Matthew. Great job. For the record, I'm not Erica Williams, I'm Landon Hadley. So, but Dr. Williams was nice enough to set this up for us. We want to open the floor for members of his committee, Dr. Petrie, Dr. Linda Wilson-Jones, and Dr. Ely. You all have the floor to ask any questions of Matthew at this time.
Hello, ma'am. Matthew, a fantastic presentation, and thank you so much. You mentioned that some of your participants said that the environment was not very welcoming. What strategies do you recommend to change this culture for the parents and English, you know what I'm saying, to students? What would you do? What recommendations would you use to change this culture?
So some of the recommendations to change the culture would be, first of all, the first thing that needs to be done is school leaders and public school teachers need to have professional development training on the diversity of cultures that these English language learners are coming from. And I'll just give you a prime example. Cumberland County has seen a steady increase in students that are classified as English language learners. And oftentimes people want to put them in the group, it's just the students who are Hispanic. But actually in recent years, we've seen students, particularly in Cumberland County, coming from Yemen, Bahrain, different parts of the Middle East. So first, I think the first thing that needs to be done is you've got to have the teachers and the school leaders need to receive the training, because many from the ESL teacher standpoint and the school leaders felt they weren't trained on this. That's step one. And then once the training is implemented, there needs to be district-wide strategic planning to ensure, for example, certain events, cultural activities are recognized. Also, being able to understand when you're lesson planning. So I'll give you an example. As a social studies teacher, and being that is my content, I had a group of students one year that actually came. I had some students who came from Yemen, and I had a student who came from Kuwait. And it was very interesting because I found out, because I used to, why is he talking to this person? And I learned, their culture is collectivist. They're not individualist, because in America, for example, we have a very individualistic culture. And in many cultures that are coming in, particularly from Latin America, also the Middle East, they're very collectivist. And so understanding that diversity, and I think once a consciousness is developed by district leaders and teachers and training is implemented, and also these strategies are, put into strategic planning approaches, those are some things that will ultimately change the culture for these students, because from the research that I conducted, many teachers want to reach these students, but they just don't know how to.
Okay, thank you. And you actually answered the second one. So thank you so much, and great presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson-Jones. Dr. Petrie?
Hey, Matthew, how you doing?
I'm well, and you?
Doing well. Good presentation and actually good study as well. My first question was along the same lines that Dr. Linda Wilson-Jones asked around what teacher preparation programs can do to improve the experiences of ELL learners. I think you pretty much answered that. So I'm going to move to the second question. Did you get the feeling from your study that some teachers were using more or working more from a cultural deficit model, not necessarily the ones in your study, but the general ELL teachers and social studies teachers were in an environment where the majority of their colleagues were maybe working from a cultural deficit model?
That's a good question. And to answer your question, I did experience that, particularly, with this study. multiple districts within the Sand Hills region. And in some districts, yes, definitely, that was apparent. And I believe a lot of it has to do with, and I know she talked about even teacher preparation programs. A lot of the reason I think we have this quote unquote with some of the districts, even in our state, is because, again, there's been a lack of training in the area. And so there's not a consciousness or an awareness. And so many of the teachers I spoke with, and believe it or not, even some of those who were ESL teachers, they even relayed how when they first started, it was like, they started out as it was a cultural deficit model for them through the past. And then eventually, as they began to work in the field, and then they had to do research for themselves. Then that's when they became a little bit more culturally conscious of the needs of these students. And I think right now, and I think that's an excellent question, Dr. Petrie. Certain parts, based upon the study I conducted in the regions, you find that some regions are definitely being more progressive in making sure that, for example, culturally relevant pedagogy is being implemented in the classroom environment to meet the needs of students, and then others are not. And thus, you do see this cultural deficit model because, again, our teacher training and also, frankly, the background of teachers, because as you are aware, in the public school settings, there is not a high percentage of teachers in the public schools who are minorities. And so that also plays a role in that cultural deficit model. What I found that was a correlation was in the districts where I did some of the interviews that seemed to have a more diverse staff or faculty population. They seem to not operate on this cultural deficit model, whereas those that were had a lower percentage of minority faculty and staff, those that had a low, tended to act from that more cultural deficit model. And a lot of it due to, their training and also personal experiences as well.
Okay, phenomenal. Then my last question is more around the advocacy piece, the first thing that you talked about. So
yes.
My question would be, what made those teachers have this kind of sense of advocacy? And the reason I'm asking that question is because I'm framing it in the context of social justice. So I mean, what made them probably be more of advocates than, say, colleagues?
Okay, I'll tell you some of them. Some of the participants, which was very interesting, relayed to me that they were English language learners in the classroom when they were children. And so they remembered what it was like for them when they were in the classroom and, not being able to, speak and communicate in the English language, not being able to understand the cultures and the customs. And so there were several of the ESL teachers felt they had to be advocates because they themselves were or are English language learners. In fact, one particular individual I interviewed shared that, she came to the United States when they were 18 years of age. And when that person came, she had just learned the English language in 4 years. And then went into the public schools to become an ESL teacher. And so because of that, she really could relate to the experiences. Also from those who maybe weren't English language learners when they were students, those educators who work with these students, some of them as well just felt that this group, particularly of students, it was interesting. One person shared that they were a content teacher. And then one year they had to work with English language learners, and it was their first year working. And as we were working that first year, they realized, oh, wait a minute, my students aren't learning. I've got to do something for them. They're not understanding. And then because of that, she gained an awareness and said, I need to be an advocate. And so that's part of the reason advocacy became such a major theme for many of the participants. And then lastly, one of the things that was relayed as well in regards to why people saw advocacy as a strong pillar, not only because it's federally mandated, mandated by our nation, but also the fact of the matter is that often these students are in families that do not, they don't communicate, in English, and many times they have to have someone to provide assistance, provide the communication, and so this group particularly. Especially, I think at this point, with ESSA, with some of the new policy, that's becoming more crucial, that as educators that we serve as advocates for these students, because their needs are not just within the classroom, but their needs also are within the home as well.
All right, thank you. Good job.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Petrie. Dr. Ely?
All right, Matthew, also, again, I echo what everybody else has said. You had a very good presentation. My question is more on the lines of the research and how you've outlined everything in the methodology. I noticed, and I did know that you had a number of people that you interviewed. And with that, sometimes, you have a tendency to either be really broad or you can go really deep. I always wanted to know, if you were able to do something like this again, would you do as many participants or and try to get a really large blanket, or would you want to go a lot deeper with fewer participants?
That's an excellent question, Dr. Ely. As I was conducting this study, I actually realized I probably would need to keep a larger pool of participants. And the reason is because ESL programs in the state are different in different districts, how the programs are being implemented. So, for example, the federal government has very general guidelines. Okay, these English language learners, these are the things that needed to be met and how they're to be addressed. But how districts implement it are very individualistic. So I'll give you an example. In Cumberland County, and this is common knowledge, ESL teachers oftentimes have to rotate from school to school. So they may service 5 to 6 schools throughout that week. Whereas in other counties where you have a larger percentage of English language learners, that teacher is only in one classroom. So for this type of study, and I found it really took a large pool of participants to get a full perspective, because how ESL programs are initiated by districts and states is very different. And so if you have a small pool of participants, just based upon the study and from what I gathered, you're not able to get a full in-depth picture and description of what is actually being experienced by these teachers and school leaders.
Okay, that's good information to know. I wasn't aware. I thought it was a little bit more standardized. So a follow-up question to that then, with knowing that, do you have any recommendations for standardization, or you think it's better that they do be very individualized in the different pockets that they are, what you're kind of seeing right now?
That's an excellent question. I actually, at this point, I'm a proponent of it should be more individualized, because the needs of districts vary from district to district and from state to state. And you'll find that English language populations are different in different states. I'll give you an example. For example, Michigan, believe it or not, has a high percentage of immigrants that have come from Europe, believe it or not, and also parts of the Middle East. And so certain models that maybe we're using in North Carolina may not apply. And then also you're dealing with issues of policy and legislation. And so when you're dealing with, districts have their own policy. And so to me, and also understanding the geography and geographic region of your population. So like in North Carolina, certain places of the state where I interview participants were more rural, versus places that were more urban. And so because of the diversity of, geographic diversity, the cultural diversity of the students, and also looking at state policies, it would have to be more individualized. Mm-hmm.
I guess then my last question on that then, how would school districts and people be able to hold them accountable? Because if it's very individualized, then that means it's going to be very expensive to evaluate those programs. So I just wanted to know, did you have any ideas on anything like that or anything that came across in your work?
Okay, in regards to the evaluation piece, okay, because what I was speaking towards was in regards to like pedagogy curriculum and standards, but so in regards to accountability, through ESL, the Every Student Succeeds Act, how the accountability measures are being done through the state is actually through the standardized testing. So, for example, students who are English language learners are required to take the same standardized tests that students who are non-English language learners. And of course, as you are aware, we look at growth. So nationally, the way to, and also the other way is through WIDA. So there actually is something in place right now to hold with the accountability, and actually with the ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, that accountability has actually increased. In fact, one of the school leaders who I interviewed shared with me that they are receiving directives from the federal government. The federal government right now is collecting data. They're not just collecting data on the English language learners, but also what they call the dual identified, which will also probably be an emerging study next, is looking at those who are English language learners in special needs. So in regards to accountability, it is being done at the federal level, looking at the growth of the students in content areas, and also which is called the WIDA standards, which most states have adopted, I would say majority. I would say, based on your question too, one thing I think that could be changed that would probably help is if every state is on the WIDA standards. Most of them are, I want to say 42, but there are a few that are not. So in regards to that, the assessment that are used to measure their growth, so that would probably be the only recommendation. But in regards to accountability, it has been addressed through the legislation.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Ely, Dr. Petrie, and Dr. Linda Wilson-Jones for your questions and comments. Now we'll turn it over to the real Dr. Erica Williams and Dean Oleon if they have any questions.
I do not have a question. Hello there.
Hey.
Oh, hello.
Hey, this is the real Erica Williams. Hey, Matthew. Just a round of acknowledgement here for an exceptional job. I spoke with you a couple of weeks ago about your study and about your trajectory, and I'm so encouraged. Very timely, very necessary topic here. And certainly one that's been on my radar for a while as someone who started her teaching career in the Sand Hills region, and even published a story on experiencing some of those culturally deficit approaches by general ed teachers. As Dr. Petrie raised in his question, I can tell you that 25 years ago, in certain areas here, if your family came on a work visa, you were not well received, and a lot of your districts were not well prepared to inherit you. And so it's good to see that in some spaces we've advanced quite a bit, even though we obviously have places left to go. I wonder how, in general, particularly in the recent years, how the socio-political context of our country at large and our state has factored into the work that you and your colleagues do in general, and wondered how that came up, if at all, in these recordings, conversations, data gathering, et cetera. Because I just imagine that although we may not be where we were in the mid-90s, I cannot imagine that under recent legislation and so forth in the country and across the state, that it has been particularly easy for those who are being served by the participants in your study?
Mm-hmm. Yes, in fact, it's interesting you state that, because many of the participants did discuss one of the, I guess, future concerns was the socio-political climate. And so, as you know, in regards to, education policy, um, whoever is in place in the government, does determine that. I know right now, particularly in the places that I, interviewed and collected data, many of them did share that due to some of the rhetoric and the political climate that their students, that they saw challenges being faced by their students, particularly with their interaction amongst their peers. It's interesting to the point that you make, and I think particularly when we look at upcoming elections and whatnot, that will determine, I guess, the direction the ESL programs will go. Right now, ESL, of course, is federally mandated. And I can speak for the districts that I can only speak for the districts that I conducted my study. The districts, of course, have and those teachers relayed that their districts are in support of those students and in support of the mandates, the federal mandates that are in place. But those are that is a matter that that is on the horizon in regards to maybe changes, reforms, policies from the maybe federal, possibly obviously within the state level that may occur in regards to ESL, and that would have direct implications on English language learners.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you again for this trajectory, for this path. And I have nothing further to add.
Thank you.
Thank
you. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I have to get on my cell phone and my computer to make this work this morning, but I want to say thank you to you, Matthew, not only for the dissertation that you presented, but for your personal interest in making the lives of ESL students better through your Fulbright work and your other awards that you've won that take you to travel in many countries where you can learn about the feelings that people have as they move from culture to culture and how they're accepted. So I know that this is not just something you do for the degree, but because you actually have lived some of these experiences and have a feeling, a warm place in your heart, as we like to say, for these students. So I want to just be clear on what's happening in our schools. Are you, by the title of your research and what you've talked about, ESL teachers and school leaders' perspectives on K-8 social studies? So it's one of your issues here that there is somewhat of a feeling among school leaders that it is appropriate to just interchange social studies teachers and ESL teachers, regardless of their background training.
There's been, in the discussions I had, with my district and also from the interviews, the need is that there needs to be more of a collaboration between the social studies and the ESL teachers, because there's been a disconnect. And also, when ESL teachers, for example, or ESL students, rather, English language learners are coming into the classroom, particularly in the elementary grades, K-6 and even K-8, there are many instances where those students are being pulled out of social studies instruction. That does occur sometimes within the county and other districts. And so what's interesting is, the students, and one of the things that came out in the study as well, in my interviews, is that many of these teachers, they're focusing on the language instruction, but at the same time, they're not getting the social studies instruction, which helps them to kind of be acculturated into the society. And so this disconnect is going in. And with this particular study, I wanted to focus, solely on a specific content area, because there's not at this point, and based on my research, there has been some studies that have focused on English language learners in social studies, but not so much from the perspective of the collaboration between the teachers and the school leaders. There's not very little has been focused on that. And so that was kind of an area of interest for me personally, as a middle school social studies teacher. And within the county, there is a lot of discussion now of moving to a model of more collaborative teaching with ESL teachers and mainstream, particularly social studies teachers working alongside. One county in particular that I interviewed, they are already initiating that, and they have yielded much success. In one county in particular, they actually have a instructional coach who is social studies certified and ESL certified. And what they do is they provide the support for those teachers, because in North Carolina right now, social studies does have an assessment called the North Carolina Final Exam. And they actually were thinking about doing away with the final exam, but as the General Assembly and DPI discussed it, they realized we're not ready to replace it, so we're going to have to possibly extend it for another 5 years. So because of these discussions, deliberations, and also these implications that are coming up, there's been a need for this now. And so you have, like, in one of the districts I conducted my study and conducted interviews. They actually have an instructional coach who's social studies and ESL certified, going to those classes, providing training for ESL teachers in best practices for social studies and ESL teachers. And in Cumberland County, what they recently did about 3 years ago was they now have something called the ESL Badge Program, which is funded by the federal government. And they provide training for mainstream teachers in all content areas and administrators. And they've even expanded it to now in the county, they have what's called the English Language Leaders Program, where and I'm involved in that now, where they're doing, it's more based on the policy piece of English language learners and how that all entails. But there's been I can say particularly in Cumberland County, there's been a real conscious effort now to really focus and address the needs of the population, since it's ever growing at this time.
And my next question, I think you've already answered, because you mentioned that there should be a longitudinal study, and I was going to ask you what would be the topic of the longitudinal study, but I think you just answered that.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right,
You're welcome.
Thank you. We'll now open it up briefly if anyone else has any questions. Thank you, Dean Oleon and Dr. Williams. Okay. Well, special shout out to Broncos and Broncoettes, and to those of you who have logged in, Matthew's friends and family. We do appreciate that. What we're going to do at this time now, we're going to politely ask you to log off. Great job, Matthew.
Thank you.
And the committee members will stay on for our brief discussions for our recommendation. And then Matthew, I'll email you so you can log back in.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Good job again.